Hey, and welcome to RPPR. This is Role Playing Public Radio, episode 196. What RPGs can learn from board games? As I'm subjecting a new person, not a person new to me, but this is maybe your first time hearing the announcer voice. How are you doing, James?
That's a disconcerting voice. I was not expecting that.
Yeah. This is James Wallace. He is my co-host on another podcast called Luddo Narrative Dissidence. This episode, we're going to be talking about what RPGs can learn from board games. As James knows a little bit about them. But yeah, the announcer voice is a long-standing RPPR tradition. And my partner, Maddie, has banned me from using it in private. So
I bet.
But yeah, so before we get into why we're talking about board games and everything, just a little bit of update on the RPPR front. It has been a few months since I've done an episode. I've been kind of busy with a lot of other projects that should be coming out soon, including one for Arc Dream. But that'll be announced in a little bit. But on the Patreon front, our newest After Hours episode is quite funny because we're talking about the most horrifying spells of Dungeons and Dragons. Speak with animals is you're basically flowers for Algernonning a little rat. And that's terrifying if you think about it. Like, why? How could giving a rat human speech capabilities is just kind of a bad thing to do to an innocent little rat in a dungeon. So Baz and David and I talk about that. Also in Recommendizer, where we talk about media recommendations for particular genres or games. Thad and I talk about zombie apocalypse media recommendations. With the gimmick that these are all books that are not about zombies. So sociology, history, riot medicine. There's a whole lot of interesting stuff. And Delta Green, Impossible Landscapes will be going up. Our first episode will be going up on early access on April 26th, and then be going up on the public feed in the first week of May. So I know a lot of you have been waiting for us to do that campaign since it came out a couple years ago, but I finally got the perfect group for it. We already have campaign art of it up on the Patreon of a poster of our 4 agents and their good friend Gary as they investigate the McAllister building and all the horrors that the King in Yellow can bring to bear on them. Check out the RPVR Patreon if you haven't already, and you can get if you're once you're done listening to this, we have so much more to show you. But as I mentioned, this episode is about what RPGs can learn from board games. And I thought about this episode because, James and I have been co-hosting Luddo Narrative Dissidence now for like 2 years. Boy, time flies. And
it really does.
It really does. And James has recently come out with a book. And tell us about the book and how it's relevant to this discussion.
Sure. The book is called Everybody Wins: 4 Decades of the Greatest Board Games Ever Made. And it's a history of the rise of modern board games since the late 70s up to the present day, seen through the lens of the Spiel des Jahres, which is the German Game of the Year award. And you may ask, why a German award? It's because it's massive. It's one of the biggest consumer awards, actually, in terms of its economic effect. Compared to its reputation. I mean, if you win the Spiel, your game will sell somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 extra copies in the next year.
Oh my
and
God.
That, I don't know if you've heard of the Booker Prize for fiction. It's just, which is possibly next to the Nobel Prize, the biggest prize for fiction in the world. Booker Prize does about half those numbers. So the Spiel is huge. And for a long time, it was mostly known in Germany. But, you won the Spiel. That was your career made.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the games that have won the Spiel over the last 44 years, it was set up in 1979, have gone on to be instrumental in this explosion of the modern board game form. A lot of them never quite made it out of Germany, particularly the early ones, the foundational ones. But the moment you get to the mid-90s, almost halfway through, with Catan was the one that blew the doors off the international market by the late, great Klaus Teuber. We're recording this in mid-April. He died at the start of April, very, very sadly, aged 70, but, long before his time. But from that point on, these are games that if you're into board games at all, or even if you're not, you will probably have heard of Ticket to Ride or Carcassonne or Codenames or Just One or games like that. These are games that have gone on to be massive international successes. Catan has sold 30 million copies now. Ticket to Ride, I think, is up to about 18 million. These are stunning numbers. These are numbers that challenge video games in terms of success. And they're board games. Who thought board games would be interesting? Or who would be commercially interesting in that kind of way? Those of us who have been into board games for as long as I have, and I am an old man, we've always known that there was something there. But doing the book was fascinating because I thought it would just basically be 44 articles on each of the games and kind of going, well, this one was significant this year because... But very quickly, it becomes about not just the games, it becomes about the mechanics and the creators and how each game has influenced each following game and how the acts, basically, it dissolves into kind of acts and sequences. And we break everything down into 4 main chunks and how the whole form grows. And I took that lens and looked at role-playing games. And I may write a lot about board games, but I'm fundamentally a role-playing designer. When I think about game design, I think about role-playing games. I've been writing stuff about role-playing games professionally since the mid-'80s when I was still at school for magazines like White Dwarf. So that's my first love.
Yeah.
And sorry, I'm just talking.
No.
Yeah. I'm in full flow. Do by all means ask me a question.
Well, yeah, a couple comments. One, the interlinking of relationships between like games and their influence on other games and other designers is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Just sort of you of course, yeah. I was sort of sparked up. I watched this video of a 5th ed D&D designer who shall go nameless, but like he talked about, I'm making up my own version of D&D. It's going to be better, and we're re-looking at all the rules. For example, I'm looking at armor, and why does armor make it you harder to hit? It should reduce damage and impair your mobility. And I'm just like, oh my god, my friend, please, you just RuneQuest exists. Yeah. It exists decades ago. Like
we have literally been talking about this stuff since the late 70s.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't, but yes, this conversation has been going on that long.
So
it's and people are making millions of dollars on Kickstarter doing. I'm going to do a stripped down D&D. We're going to take out the stuff that doesn't make sense. Or just the other day, another one funded, and it's like I mean, on one level, I'm glad this is happening. I'm glad there is an appetite for new designs. On another, do we have to have the same conversation over and over again?
Yeah, exactly.
This is one of the things that board games didn't do. They embrace new mechanics and new ideas. There's no nostalgia in the wider board game market. Yes, Monopoly still sells. Still arguably the biggest board game in the world. Hasbro are reluctant to release figures on that, but in terms of market presence, it's still there, and it's over 100 years old. Yeah. It was originally created under the name the Landlord's Game by a woman called Elizabeth McGee, who essentially had the design stolen from her by Clarence Darrow, who's the chap who was for a long time acknowledged as the creator of Monopoly. What he did mostly was change the name.
Yeah.
And to take it back to Parker Brothers, who had refused it previously when McGee pitched it to her, but Clarence Darrow goes in and they go, "Oh, a lovely middle-class white man. Of course we will accept your board." I don't know what the conversation was, but I suspect sexism may well have had something to do with it. So there is a certain nostalgia for the old, but at the same time within board games, there has been this appetite for new mechanics. It's not the cult of the new.
Yeah.
Although there's an element of that, but it has been people going, are there better ways of doing this? Are there more fun ways of doing this? And a lot of it, and I teach board game design as well. I run workshops. I used to teach at university level until quite recently. The whole design process is referred to as finding the fun, the iterative process of you design something, you test it, you think about how it went, you change the design based on feedback, then then you test it again, and that iterative process is known colloquially as finding the fun, because you can't sit down and deliberately design fun into a board game. Fun doesn't work that way. You have to find it, you have to look for it, you have to identify it, amplify it if you can. And this is something that I don't see so much in the mainstream of role-playing design. I mean, there is. We almost have our analog for Monopoly. Dungeons and Dragons is very much like that. It does change. Monopoly does change. There's Monopoly Deal. There's a bunch of new Monopolies, and they do play a bit better. They play faster. They play. The rules are less onerous, and but it's still fundamentally Monopoly in the same way that D&D is always and fundamentally D&D.
Yeah. Nothing else.
It's it has its flavor. It's interesting for a game with no background and I suppose the Sword Coast and all the rest of it has kind of become the official background, but there's none of that in the rule books. You buy Monopoly, you buy Dungeons and Dragons. There was a Dungeons and Dragons Monopoly. I'm sure they may have been.
There's a branded version of Monopoly for everything. It's like one for Fortnite now. Like, I'm sure it's out there, especially because with the D&D movie out this year. Like, I'm sure there's a whole.
Well, I was going to say, if you went to see the D&D movie and you loved that, and you went, what are all these places that I've heard of? Where's that spectacular prison? The city, all the rest of it. What's the Underdark? And you buy the 3 D&D books, thing. Literally, there's 600 pages here. Got to be in there somewhere. Not a mention of possibly somewhere lurking in the monster manual. But it's weirdly flavorless. But then you look out to the story games and the avant-garde stuff and the stuff that people are just throwing up on itch, and the ideas that are coming out of that and the cross-fertilization of that is very much what happened in the kind of the Cambrian period of the board game explosion as well, where people were throwing out new ideas, coming up with some really elaborate and clever new things, some of which caught on in a big way, ideas like card drafting, and some of which didn't at all and have disappeared. I have in my collection not one but 2 separate German board games which contained rocks as games components, actual rocks in the box, and this was a short-lived trend and has not reappeared so far as I can tell. But you don't know if it's going to work in the market until you try it. And that's one of the things I find really exciting about where we are in role-playing right now. There is so much going on, so much variety. You want a game for anything. You can find, if not the game itself, then a system that will allow you to model that in some kind of way. It's really great. And the mechanics as well. We're stripping down the stuff from the massive rule books of D&D. Some people go the other way into 500-page rule books. But there's so much stuff that's really boiling it down to the fad for 1-page, 2-page RPGs. Honey Heist, the success of Honey Heist, which if people don't know it, it's basically you're a bear and you're doing a robbery, mostly for honey. And that's That's basically the whole pitch for the game. And as long as you understand the basic way that a role-playing game works, you're going to have fun with it. And it's not meant to be a campaign game. It's meant to be wasting an hour making jokes with your mates game. But it's proven that there's a space in the market for that.
No, for sure. There is a huge amount of variety, demand for different styles of games, because as much as the D&D, makers, want to assume that you only need one game to do everything. In fact, it turns out having a rule set that accommodates different styles of play or like different goals can be a lot of fun. And you bring up some good points of talking about like what as a role playing game is getting together to tell a story versus what I kind of see like a lot of board games are. There's sort of 2 modes of them. Like one, like role playing games are very much focused on storytelling, right? Usually in some way. But board games, a lot of them obviously have narrative elements, but ultimately they're like puzzle solving in a sense. Like you're trying to optimize, and of course, a lot of board games are competitive although some are, collaborative, but it's like role playing games are collaborative storytelling versus collaborative or competitive puzzle solving or optimization or efficiency, basically figuring out, and obviously because board games are so huge, there are ones that are just like, let's tell a story, and then there are ones that are basically like D&D but with more grid and better combat rules, like Gloomhaven. Yeah, it's really fascinating
It
to look at,
it really is.
examine the two and see what the differences are. Like the other day, I watched this horror movie trailer and I immediately thought of an RPG idea for it, and I realized, oh, it's like a worker placement RPG. Like if you everyone picks like one thing to help them fight the evil monster or whatever that they're all being stalked by, but if you like choose, my gimmick was that like if you choose to be the occult expert, you know more about the occult, you're the goth or whatever, then everyone else is worse at it. No one else can be good at occult. Or if you're
that's the mechanic we used in Paranoia.
Yeah.
I did with Grant Howitt, who did Honey Heist, and Paul Dean, the games reviewer. We did the Paranoia reboot of a few years ago, and that's basically the character generation system. One player, you name your skill, and the player next to you is then negative at it. And then I can't remember if we did the thing, because it's based on a mechanic I came up with for a game I never actually published about cop shows. But the idea was one person names a skill, they are automatically the best in it. The player next to you is automatically the worst in it. And then everyone else can't take that skill at all. They're just average. And so once you've gone around the table 2 or 3 times, you've got this really interesting party with a lot of variety, but with specialists and weaknesses as well. And it works really well. It's not complex in terms of rules. And thinking back to the stuff that we've looked at in Ludonarrative Dissidence, some of the games there was one game that took 5 pages to explain the initiative system. You don't need that. People get it.
Yeah.
Yes, there is a market for that level of complexity. But I think, if you want to do that, put it in a supplement. Complexity, and again, this is one of the things that comes out of board games. There's a quote, I started using it, and then people started, established designers started using it as well. So clearly it kind of occupies a thing. It's from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote The Little Prince during World War II. And he said, perfection is achieved not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. And for me, that's the essence of games design. It's stripping out and stripping down and paring things down to the bare minimum of the rules that you need to create the effect you want.
Yeah.
You don't create good systems and good rules by piling on more complexity.
Yeah.
You create the effect by stripping it back. So it's, you've almost taken away the rules and you've just left the structure.
Yeah. And I think that's what RPGs often miss, is that there's not, like you were talking about earlier about finding the fun. And I think that because one thing I had no idea that like board games, especially, being an award-winning one, would, have 6 digits of additional unit sales. Obviously there's more money and more discipline into it than RPGs, which are often a hobbyist thing. There's very few designers who make a full time designing RPGs.
Sadly, the same's true of board games as well.
Really?
I mean, it wasn't really until the 90s that there were any professional board game designers in Germany. Still, the number is pretty small. The vast majority of people out there are doing it as a hobby, or even running companies as a hobby. Because and this has always been true of role-playing games. Back in the mid-90s, I set up a company called Hogshead Publishing, which quite quickly became the largest RPG publisher in the UK, not least because for a while we were the only RPG, because it was very easy for RPG publishers to set up and go bust because there were no other companies they could turn to for advice in the UK. I had been freelancing in the States for a while, so I could talk to John Nephew of Atlas Games. I could talk to Kevin Simbida at Palladium. I did a couple of books for Palladium, my first professional games book writing. And, people have strong opinions about Palladium and its output. But
common subject here at RPPR.
I bet. But Kevin knows the business and he knows the practicalities. And his advice was just invaluable. I worked a lot with Eric Wujik of Phage Press, who did Amber Diceless. People like that I could turn to for advice. And their assistance was what allowed Hogshead to become the largest company of its type in the UK. And at its peak, I sold it in 2010 2002, 2003. But at its peak, it had 2.5 full-time employees, and I wasn't one of them. I was working a full-time job in magazines because it paid much better. And, and was then employing young people who were prepared to take a not great salary to get some experience in the role-playing industry, some of whom have, gone on to be significant, to make a reputation for themselves, some in academia, some in reviewing. But yeah, an awful lot of companies that from the outside look like they are operations are actually, one or two guys working out of a garage or a spare bedroom in their spare time. My game, The Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen, was written while I was commuting. It was written on my knee on a little palm top computer, if you remember palm tops from the late 90s, the Scion 5. Amazing piece of technology. And literally grabbed and kind of, if I could get a seat on the tube, I'd get 30 minutes of writing time on the way into work. And there's a lot of that. There really is.
Yeah. I think, so it's interesting, not even a question of money then. It's just, I want to say, why do board game designers spend so much time playtesting versus RPG designers who often are, and this is not just, I think this is a systemic issue in RPGs where even the big dogs, even the big publishers of RPGs, don't playtest the games as much as they should. They don't spend as much time finding the fun to revise their rules, to get that sweet balance. I'm not saying obviously all RPGs, but we've all read big releases this was barely, boy, there's some big problems in this set of rules. This does not make a lot of sense. So I wonder why that is, because maybe it's because of the nature of RPGs. RPGs are collaborative, and a good game master, often game designers are very experienced at running games, can paper over a problem through good storytelling, knowing the individual table. And in a board game, you just have the game, right? There are the rules and there are the components, and you follow these rules to play the game. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
I think you've hit it exactly there. Yeah, it's. GM and players will often collaborate because they're enjoying the story, they're enjoying the experience, to disguise the fact that the rules aren't quite having the desired effect. Whereas as a board game is much more straight up. The thing is on the table in front of you. One of the reasons I used board games a lot when I was teaching game design is because, with video games, it's like trying to explain a car's engine with the hood down. You can't see the inner workings. You can hear them ticking. You think, is that a cylinder misfiring? No, in a board game, it's very, very obvious where it's not working. And there is always that temptation to just keep tweaking and keep going for improvement. But a role-playing game, at least what we think of as a commercial role-playing game, is a much, much more complicated system than most board games. There's so many rules. A lot of them don't get used every session or every campaign.
That's true. We were just, I was talking earlier, running this Delta Green campaign, and I've run, dozens of sessions, over the years, and in this campaign, new rules that have been in the player handbook since it came out in 2015 are the first time I'm actually reading or actually paying attention to them, because it's agents got wounded and then they have to recover, and usually when I run Delta Green, they're just dead and the game is over. Oh wait, they have recovery times, and there's all these other things that come up because they have this lingering injury that is hindering them. And and I'm glad this is a case where they did play test it, because it made sense and it was thematic for the game. But that could have been easily overlooked, and had a agent with a gut shot just running around doing parkour with no problems, and which would have not made sense. So that's the sheer. With a RPG also, you usually try to tell much more. It's a much more versatile game system, except for the very most focused thing, like Honey Heist. Extremely focused, but that's the exception, not the rule.
Yes, unless you're looking at stuff like the one that springs to mind is Monster Hearts. Avery Alder's just brilliant game of teenage monster romance. And it's based on the Powered by the Apocalypse system, but she does so much with it, and it's really, really smart. But it's very, very focused on that idea of you are essentially young monsters falling in love with, huge emotions, but also huge desires because you're monsters. Werewolves got a wolf and all the rest of it. Vampires got to suck blood. It's great, and it has that focus, and the rules absolutely reflect that. The other one I'd call out particularly is Microscope, which is not really a role-playing game. It's a world-building game or a history-building game. Really simple, sleek system, and there are bits of role-play in there as you get down to it. Where you're collaboratively building a history of a thing by adding incidents, but you can choose to put new incidents in between things that other people have established, or you can drill down into them, go into further depth about what happened. And again, it's the rules create an effect. All of the narrative comes from the players. There's no setting for this thing. The setting is completely up to you. But the structure of it is really, really tight. And that, I think, again, that's where something like board games can inform role-playing games.
I mean,
look for a tight structure for controlling the narrative, which is kind of, D&D shies away from that quite a lot. Yeah. The tight structure in D&D is around combat, and still these days, the vast majority of the rule books are concerned either directly or indirectly with fighting things, or destroying things or blowing stuff up, with or without magic.
Well, usually with magic, let's be honest.
Usually with magic. Yes.
D&D does have this kind of like systemic bias against like martial and rogue classes, especially in later edition. Well, like 4th edition was fairly balanced, but 5th edition has gone back to like the 3rd edition. Like, screw you, Jocks. But that again, my just my opinion. But Microsoft, actually, I played that recently. I played it several times now, and it's almost like a board game in a lot of respects because you use note cards, kind of like build out a timeline, right? And you can go vertically or horizontally across this timeline to go into more depths in certain areas, eras, or into individual scenes. So yeah, that's actually a storytelling game that is like blurs the line between what is a board game and an RPG, because it is it relies on spatial relations between the cards. Like, there is a timeline. And then you drill down into certain events to get into very particular moments. And yeah, that's obviously a game that was playtested it seems like it was playtested quite extensively to get to that level, because it is such a very solid set of rules. But yeah, there's another storytelling game I've read, but I haven't played yet, called Dialect, which also uses note cards, about building up a language, a dialect of a small group, an isolated, community, and how that dialect is born and how it dies, over time.
Yes, I have heard of it. Yeah. Now you describe it.
Yeah, it's very cool. I really want to play it sometime, but like I got it right before the pandemic. I just haven't brought it to. Yeah, and so it's like, oh well, it relies on note cards. I'm not going to play in cards, and I'm not going to use this for a while. And now I'm getting back into playing games in person, so I might break it out at some point. But I mean, I think that's and these are elements in using cards and like how they relate to each other on a table is something. It's just one example of like, I think RPGs can learn from boards. I mean, you mentioned D&D, and obviously that is, a lot of D&D is also uses space because it uses like a grid. It uses maps and like minis, and especially in later editions.
Yes, and very much came out of the tradition of wargaming and was designed by a couple of gamers who, we were used to all of those conventions and has never quite shucked that off. It's still at its heart, all its terminology and things like initiative, which we talk about. We have an entire episode of the narrative dissonance talking about initiative systems, and all of that, and even hit points and armor classes come straight out of wargames. Still at heart, an awful lot of RPGs are rooted, whether the designers know it or not, rooted in the wargame tradition. And I think as soon as designers start looking at really what they've got and going, do we need this stuff? Do we need this baggage? We can do more. And again, this was what catapulted board games forward. The fact that people felt that they could leave the past behind. They could take what they wanted from old designs, but they didn't have to take the whole thing. They didn't have to be constrained by boards. They didn't have to be constrained by dice. It could do really whatever they wanted. The moment you make that jump, you don't have to shuffle cards and deal them out. There are other ways of distributing cards. There are better ways of distributing cards to players. The moment you realize that, you are free, and you will find yourself creating really interesting types of games.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to flash back to 1998 when I did The Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which I was talking to a friend about recently, which was essentially the first story game. It's the first short form, both in terms of page count. The original was only 24 pages, but it's a single session role-playing game. It's GM-less. It's very much rules light and story heavy, and it's heavy on the humor. And actually, it only has a page of rules. The rule book was padded out to 24 pages because you can't sell one page of rules, or at least you couldn't in 1998, which, is pre the ebook market, almost pre PDFs, certainly pre much e-commerce. And I was running a commercial company at the time. The thing is, when I published Baron Munchausen, the reason I did it was because I'd been running Hogshead at that point for 4 years, which was a company I set up largely to publish my own games designs at a couple of friends. And that hadn't happened for commercial reasons. We'd had to, because we got screwed by a couple of distributors and were in hock to the bank. I had to just focus on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which was our breadbasket, basically, our money maker, under license from Games Workshop. Paid off our bank loans, all the rest of it. And then it was like, I'm going to do a game with my name on it. If it kills me, I don't care if it's only 24 pages. I don't care if nobody buys it. I'm just going to do this thing. And had this idea. I did not realize that this was a radical jump forward, that nobody had done anything quite like this before. But I'd been mucking around with kind of improvisational games and improvisational drama a lot. And there was some of this stuff had been just part of the vernacular of the circles of British role-playing designers that I had moved in, really since the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it didn't feel like a big jump forward. It's just nobody had published this stuff before. So yeah, there is an element of, free your mind and your ass will follow.
Mm-hmm.
Free your mind and your design will follow. I think read widely, play games widely, play board games. Look at what they're doing with mechanics. See if you can take some of those mechanics and build them into your role-playing game. Not in the same way that there are role-playing games. The majority of role-playing games are based on war games.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's an awful lot that one can learn from the modern narrative board games that have been influenced by D&D, but also influenced by the German school of very stripped-down mechanics designs. I think people can learn lessons from about how to tell stories with games from that kind of stuff and build that back into role-play, and role-playing games will be stronger as a result.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you're right, because as an example, I was talking with my friend Caleb, Stokes, the author of Red Markets.
Oh yeah.
And we both played Gloomhaven, and as we were talking, he just casually brought up the idea that someone should make, like, I really like what Gloomhaven did with randomization, where in Gloomhaven you don't roll dice. You get a little deck of cards that have numbers on them, and these range from, like, absolute miss to critical hit. And as you improve your character, you actually make changes to that deck. You actually remove you can choose to remove bad cards or add in new cards, or even better cards that have you not just hit, you do elemental damage, or you slow them, depending on what like the rogue would be adding poison, or the elemental shaman would be adding ice damage or whatever. And that would be and I was making a joke. Oh, well, that's true. With print on demand cards, you could just knock something like out in 5th ed. Want to do a Kickstarter, do really well? It's like, no, Ross, you'd have to play test. It'd have to be balanced. You'd have to go through a lot of changes to think about the numbers. And you would think, nah, just 1 through 20, done. And add some art on it. And some people would eat it up. But I that would be one example of that. Is that kind of deck building element instead of like dice. But like, I guess, and we already talked about worker placement as an idea for RPGs, but like, what are some other mechanics, I guess, in board games that you think would be really applicable to RPG designs?
Now you're putting me on the spot. I do think deck building is very underused in
Mhm.
RPGs, and I think because some people are reluctant to do cards, and cards are logistically difficult, and it's
Mhm.
difficult to store cards, particularly between sessions. Um, uh, I mean, to be honest, if I knew, I would be designing those games right now.
Yeah.
I'm still active as a designer, and there's stuff I'm pulling out. The thing I'm noodling on 2 or 3 designs at the moment. Um, but one of them is and it was going to be one of the projects we published at Hogshead and
Hmm.
never happened because we had no money to do it. At the time, it was called Frup. I now call it Dandy.
Hmm.
And it's a fantasy role playing game set in your absolutely bog standard fantasy world with elves and dwarves and dragons and dungeons and treasure and stuff. Except that 1,000 years ago, 3 colossal books, each as thick as a man stands tall, fell from the sky and were discovered by a group of wandering, extremely belligerent and very devout monks
Mhm.
who recognized these as what they could only be, which is the word of the gods.
Hmm.
These are the message that the god has sent the people. And so they spent a century deciphering the books. And the books are the books of Dandy. Because if you haven't got the joke, think about the word dandy and how close that is to the initials D and D. They're the D&D rule books.
Heyo.
They have fallen. So you zoom forward 900 years, you have a society in which everybody absolutely believes that they are a character or possibly a non-player character in a game of D&D being played by the gods. And this is enforced with a fist of steel by the church, who has founded this entire religion on this. So everyone has a character sheet and everyone has an alignment. And if you are found without your character sheet, then you're a non-player character or possibly a monster and you can be killed for the experience points. And it's this colossal Baroque thing. So obviously the mechanics of Dandy are
Mhm.
basically the D&D mechanics. But then it's got this other system of mechanics by which the world actually works.
Hmm.
Because the way the world works and the way the books say the world works are completely different. Magic, for example, works in such a way that there are 7th and 8th level wizards and sorcerers who actually can't cast a single spell because, their character sheet says they can, but they don't actually understand how magic works whatsoever. So the mechanics I have for the way the world works are really quite board game influenced. They're much more granular, much more simple. People don't have hit points at all. They have lives in the way that cats do, except you're never quite sure how many you've got left. And things like that. So it's much more aimed at storytelling. It's a much more of a narrative system rather than something descended from a simulationist war game.
Hmm.
And I'm having so much fun going back to that. I left it every 5 or 10 years. I go back to it and go, is the time right? But I think right now with the D&D movie and people going, oh, Dungeons and Dragons is the way that all role-playing games are. It's like, no, we must,
Yeah.
this is me undermining the foundations of the Wizards of the Coast Castle. My little act of sabotage, Dandy. Whether I'll actually get it out this time, I don't know, but I'm having a lot of fun with it.
Yeah.
But that is, I'm pulling in a lot of my influences from German board games to inform the mechanical design of that.
Yeah.
It's so much fun.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, coming up with novel game mechanics on the fly is kind of a steep challenge. But looking at a list of just types of common board game mechanics, I realized we already talked about some games like this, like on Ludonarrative Narrative Dissonance. The episode isn't like dexterity games, like Dread literally uses Jenga, so that's obviously in there. Obviously dice pooling systems are very common in role-playing games. But I kind of want to see certain other types of mechanics. I kind of, maybe it would be a better way to look at this is like, if I mention a type of board game mechanic, like what kind of RPG could go with that as sort of like a thought exercise. So like the first one I think is the most like Euro board game thing, which is of course auction mechanics. So where everyone makes bids on, various resources or things like that. And you only have so much money, and there's only, there's Power Grid, obviously, tons of games, Castle Mad King Ludwig, tons and
Mm.
tons of games use auction mechanics. So,
Oh yeah, I
uh,
mean Reiner Knizia is the great master. Modern Art,
mhm,
probably the great auction game.
mhm.
Yeah, I mean it's been done in RPGs. The Amber Diceless game I mentioned, Eric Wujek. It's a diceless RPG, so there's your character generation has no random factors at all. And if you don't know Amber, the idea is you're all members of the same family, and it's a warring family. You're all kind of siblings of the same generation. You hate each other.
Mhm.
Um, and so being best in a particular attribute is auctioned off. And it's
Okay.
not that you've got the most points, it's that you are best. That's what you want to win the auction because you will be the best in the family or in that generation in a particular area. And what it does is it's not just really clever and a really interesting diceless way of doing this,
Mhm.
but it also sets up competition between the characters, the slight resentment that the second best has for the best before you've even started role playing, before you've started, you really fleshed out your characters. There's already that dynamic between them, that the tensions between the different players. It's really nice. It's really clever. And I can't think of anyone else who's used it,
Yeah.
which is such a shame.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. That would, oh man, now I'm trying to think about it. Yeah, that would be my obvious thing. Would be like it's an intrigue focused game.
Mm.
Where
Yes, one where the players, the
yeah.
characters start off already within the dynamics of a fairly complicated relationship.
I think
Yeah.
maybe a version of an auction mechanic that's between the players and the GM, and the idea is the players are ostensibly working together, but everyone has like a secret agenda. You could
Mm.
do this as any number of things. They're all supposed to work together, but there's a tension
Yeah.
between them, and the players and the GM, or the GM and the players, are all auctioning off various things that will or will not happen in the game, like. And so the players want certain things in, and everyone wants a slightly different set of circumstances for the scenario. So like,
Mm.
do you want sharks in the adventure? You don't want sharks in the adventure. And so you bid on that, and the shark token or the shark card. And if you win the auction, you get to determine what level the sharks will be in the scenario. So the
Mm.
GM wants certain things to happen. And everybody else has maybe one player's like, oh, I'm a marine biologist, I know all about sharks, let's throw sharks in, that'll be easy for me. And then the other player's like,
Mm.
well, no, my character is actually a secretly a were shark. If sharks show up, if that shows up, then I'll be cursed and the bad thing will happen to me. And like, but nobody knows, and nobody's supposed to reveal things. So you're all supposed to, so that could be an interesting mechanic where if there's uncertainty, right, you're trying to guess
Mm.
everyone's secret agenda. So that would be,
Yes, that could work well.
yeah, because that's
I,
not
I
quite as
was
competitive, right, as Amber, because Amber sounds
no.
very PvP. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not all PvP. There are moments you're kind of forced to work together against greater threats, but
Hmm.
there's always this jostling for position and essentially for your father's love,
Hmm.
because that's Amber. I was, as you were saying that, I was thinking vaguely about maybe using it some way for an initiative system for who goes first
Oh,
in the
okay.
round, but it would probably take too long. Because
Well,
initiative systems need to be fast.
yeah.
They should do their job and get out of the way for the main event, which is the combat.
Right. Well, unless the
Uh,
initiative system is the combat, like who goes first, also, it was just a quick and a
yeah,
dead, right? So like, it could also be like an initiative slash advantage system, right? Like it's the same
Mm,
thing. Like you go first, or you get a plus 10 on your hit roll, or you get this bonus, or you get a narrative bonus or something like that. So you get to choose, you pick your poison, right? Like,
yes.
so that could, yeah, that could be an interesting set of choice, and then maybe you could gain a benefit at the auction, or like get more money to spend, essentially more currency, by sacrificing something from your character, if you really want to
Yes.
win it. So yeah,
That's nice.
yeah.
Yeah.
The
I'm,
Yeah, go.
I was just going to jump back a step or two because you
Mhm.
challenged me to come up with mechanics that I
Oh
think
yeah.
could be used. And I've come up with two.
Mm.
The first is bluff. The,
Okay.
the the bluff mechanic, which again we did actually use in the Paranoia initiative system, where Paranoia has a card-based combat system, and we went with cards because that was what the publisher requested us to design.
Hmm.
But the idea is every card, all the cards have effects, but separate to that, they've got numbers on them. And so you put down a card in front of you for what your initiative value is, but you can lie You can just put down any and the GM then calls out, going, yeah, okay, 10, 9, 8, and if you go, oh yeah, I'm on 9, and you say what you're doing or whatever. If you say, yeah, oh, I'm on 9, any other player can go, I don't think you are. I'm pretty sure you don't have a 9 face down in front of you, and you have to flip your card. And if it's not a 9, you don't go.
Yeah.
So you're jockeying for position, and that's really fun. And that ties into the other one, which is push your luck, which is, do you take an additional risk, which may give you a big reward or may result in failure or a greater failure.
That mechanic I've seen in a lot of RPGs.
Oh yes, I've seen it used. I don't think it's part of the common vernacular of mechanics.
Yeah,
I don't think it's broken through into the mainstream yet, and yet it's so fun.
Yeah,
push your luck games are, well, it's the heart of gambling apart from anything else. But there's so much richness in there, and so much that you can do with them. And role-playing games should be about risk, not just the simple risk of rolling a dice. And again, look at the way that board games are doing amazing things with dice and dice results and all the rest of that, and take some of that and use that in role-playing games, rather than just rolling a dice. Oh, you succeed. Oh, you fail. It's, again, we've been doing that since Gygax and Arneson. There's so much more that you can do with dice.
Yeah,
and dice rolls.
I did see actually, speaking of dice as a novel mechanic in of themselves, I'm not sure how you would describe this mechanic, but Mothership has an interesting system for generating new spaceships. Like you're out in deep space, where you roll a bunch of d6s and then arrange them into a shape that would look like a spaceship, like in a vague, boxy kind of like cargo. Like Mothership is very much like Aliens, like blue collar sci-fi, like and what you roll, the top side determines what kind of compartment it is. So you can kind of allocate, like, this is engine, this is storage, this is hab, life support or whatever, or weapons, and then so you can generate, and there's different tables for different types of ships. But that's how you generate a ship on the quick, is just like you can scan it from your own ship, so you know what how it's laid out like, and it's like this. But you don't know what the surprises are in the ship. But that's like a map and an entire ship generation system. So I don't know if any board games have. I'm sure there's board games that have that kind of mechanic. I'm not sure what you would call that, but like a dice mapping kind of thing. The last type of mechanic, because I have a novel idea for it, would be tile placement. Tile placement, obviously, Carcassonne. Been there forever. You're King Domino, like just tons and tons of games where you place tiles, and based how they're set, that's how you're scoring. So almost all of those are like physical geographic games, right? Like yes. Carcassonne is literally the landscape. King Domino and then Patchwork is like a quilt. So I was thinking like using a tile placement game to represent a more abstract landscape in either the emotional, psychic, like landscape or environment that the characters have to deal in. So imagine a game where everyone is a psychic, and there is this massive psychic, like, just energy out there, right? Like, it's not just and so the GM would start laying out tiles to describe, this place is haunted. It's really dark vibes, and starts placing all these tiles, and in order to, players would have to place tiles to activate their powers. And based on where they place them, it interacts with the negative tiles in a certain way. So the players are trying to like cleanse or purify the psychic, environment from the evil, while the GM is obviously placing their own tiles to make it worse for the players or more interesting. So that would be more of a collaborative thing, right? Like you're all fighting and you can make actions to place additional tiles. Or certain tiles can only be placed if you sacrifice things on your character, or any number of things. So that would be my big galaxy brain thing, is like it's not a landscape, it's a psychic landscape. Or maybe you could do the same thing for someone's soul, like, are they going to heaven or hell, and like the inner struggle or something like that. Because you could do things like infection, like, you place one bad tile, then next turn all the tiles around it turn bad unless you negate it or something like that.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, that's sparking all sorts of ideas
Yeah.
in my head. I'd probably take a jump to the side and go with something more like a jigsaw puzzle,
Hmm.
which again I think is a massively underused concept or mechanic. But the idea of assembling a picture or assembling a piece
Oh,
or something.
yeah.
The other thing you sparked was the idea of, and I think someone is doing this or has done this recently as a game.
Mhm.
I have a memory of a conversation, can't think of any names attached to it, but a game in which you're basically assembling the investigation wall, the pictures
Oh,
of the
yeah,
suspects
yeah,
and the strings connecting
yeah.
them and
Hmm.
all the rest of that. And essentially the bits that you pick up along the way in the game, everything has its place on the wall. Because who doesn't love that? Just as a visual representation, building that up as a game. I'm always amazed that there are so many murder mystery games and escape room games out there, and I've yet to see one that plays off that. You're building the investigation wall
Yeah.
metaphor.
Maybe a logistical thing, simply because like you can't include a pin board because there's no foldable pin boards, at least I'm aware of.
True. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, you can't. Make sure you have like a 3 by 4 foot section of wall that you can hang a pin board to do this game.
Yeah.
But yeah, that would
Something
be
like
interesting. It's you mentioned the jigsaw thing. That would be really cool because one thing I found out. Some artists figured out that this company that makes jigsaw puzzles, they use the same like patterns. They just put different
Yes.
pictures on them, and so like they figured out which patterns, and they would like make collage or mash up jigsaw puzzles where they take, oh, this is half of this is a horse but half of this is a landscape, or like really weird imagery by like mixing and matching from different jigsaw sets. And so you could do like have 2 jigsaws, one good, one bad, and you're trying to replace the bad one with the good one. And
That would be great.
yeah,
Or print text on the jigsaw pieces.
mhm.
You're not going to know the story until you've got every piece in place.
Oh,
But
yeah.
some of the pieces are the wrong pieces.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's real potential there.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of fun ideas, and I mean, if anything, like the main thing is like playtest your games before you publish them. Like the more you
Yes.
got to find your fun, like, and that is
Yeah.
yeah.
And the other thing, which I advise my game design students, is play games of types that you have never played before.
Oh, yeah.
Go way outside your comfort zone. Go and watch people, even if you can't play them, at least watch other people playing them. Go and watch people playing Warhammer. There's loads of interesting ideas about what makes Warhammer such a massive, massive game in terms of the market. How does it get its claws into people? Why are people so into it? For sports simulations on your PC or an Xbox or something like that, you may not be into sports, but those are some of the best-selling games every year.
Oh,
And
sure.
it's not just because they're sports. It's look at the mechanics. Again, what's working? What's making that so interesting? How can you take that and how can you use that?
Yeah. Excellent points. But when we come back, we'll have some shout outs. And we're back with some shout outs as always. So I'd like to begin with this is not a new book by any stretch of the imagination, but I read it recently, so it's new to me. It is Who Fears the Devil? It is a collection of short stories by American author, and this is a real name, Manly Wade Wellman. It was released in 1963. Originally, but has been republished several times. I read the most recent one from Planet Stories, and these are about Silver John, who is Manly Wade Wellman's character, who is an Appalachian folk singer and wanderer who travels around the mountains of Appalachia, fighting witches, ghosts, and other evil things. It sort of takes like the ideas of American folklore and ghost stories and sort of combines them with some pulp elements. Like he finds a portal to another universe and like some weird creature coming out of it. He uses the Doppler effect in one story to trick a ghost train from taking a woman. and a lot of other cool things. But it's this weird eclectic mix of like, 50s and 60s pulp, sci-fi and horror and fantasy, and like, yeah, just 19th century folklore. So I found it quite interesting. It's a lot of fun. So yeah, James.
I'm going to kick off with a novel from just a few years ago, The Night Ocean by Paul Lafarge. Paul, who I didn't know, died at the start of this year from cancer, very sadly, aged in his early 50s, again, long before his time. The Night Ocean is really interesting. It starts off in the present day with a suicide or a possible suicide, but very quickly jumps back in time. And the meat of its narrative is about the relationship between the famous early science fiction and horror fan R.H. Barlow and the horror writer H.P. Lovecraft. Barlow was an early correspondent of Lovecraft's. Barlow was 13 when they started corresponding. And the book postulates in some ways that Lovecraft went down to Florida to visit him, which I believe is documented fact, and that they may or may not have had an emotional and possibly even physical relationship. This is a book about unreliable narrators, essentially. There are several people who tell stories through the course of the book. You can trust, essentially, I would say, probably none of them. That all of them are, deceiving us to one level or another. But fundamentally, if you're interested in Lovecraft, this is a side of his life that you will probably not know very much about. It's also a fascinating and incredibly well-researched document about the early days of the very early days of fandom, when people who went on to be some of the big names in science fiction in the 50s and 60s and 70s were starting out as science fiction fans in their teens and their 20s, doing, poorly produced fanzines in tiny runs, corresponding with each other by mail, or very, very occasionally meeting up, and the overlap between fandom and politics, and Lovecraft's politics does come into it a lot. It actually spends a lot of time with Barlow. Barlow was H.P. Lovecraft's the executor of his literary estate, and is a controversial figure was back then a controversial figure in Lovecraft fandom, and I believe remains today. I wasn't entirely satisfied by the book. I felt it fudged a number of things, and if you don't know what is true and what is not in this particular history, it does not clarify that. But at the same time, it's a fascinating read and a fascinating insight from somebody who clearly did do the research. There's a lot to enjoy in there.
That sounds fascinating. I'll have to put on my to read list, because I've read some of Lovecraft's biography, some background material on him, but there's so many letters to read of his. There's only so much Lovecraftian scholarship I can digest in a day. But a novel, it would be a good way of and just as a work of art, I looking at reviews of it saying this is a biographical novel, not a horror novel. So it is very much, it sounds like very much a drama, not like, because a lot of
it is about horror. It is not a horror novel.
Yeah. Because a lot of things that use Lovecraft, use him, be like, oh, he knew the truth and he was a fool or whatever, like the Laundry Files, for example, references Love. They actually have a short story about Lovecraft encountering Lovecraftian horrors. I think it's called Equus, that Charles Stross wrote. Very an actual realistic depiction of him would be a very interesting thing to read. My next shout out is a storytelling game. It is called A Town Called Malice, a Nordic horror story game from Monkey Fun Studios. This is very much it's a focus of Nordic noir, things like Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, and also isolated small town horror like 30 Days of Night, The Thing, and Salem's Lot. So mechanically, it is very inspired by Fiasco. But it's about all the players collaborate to make up a messed up town. And basically there's a town, an event, and a body. And so the town is about to hold the event, but then the game, the storyline of the game begins with the body being discovered, and then um so like when I played it, actually Jeff Barber, creator of Blue Planet, ran it for me, Maddie, and another friend, and we made up this fishing town. You know, it's always called Malice, and it was holding a festival to help bring new people in. And body was found, and it turns out the pillars of the town running it were doing horrible things that may or may not be supernatural. And it ended in murder and bloodshed, and I do remember my character was the cannery owner who was doing all these horrible things to keep the business running. And I said, well, the darkness is a job creator, which is everyone was like, oh my God, Ross, I didn't think you could make such a horrible character. It's like, well, yeah, it is. It was a lot of fun, and you can make up all kinds of messed up little towns. And if you like Twin Peaks as well, like that's another influence. So yeah, it's worth checking out. James?
Cool. I'm gonna shout out Die by Kieran Gillen, which is it was a comic series that ran a few years ago, is now collected into, I believe, 5 volumes. And it is, Kieran himself describes it as the D&D cartoon for goths. It's basically about a group of friends who in the early 80s gather for one of their 16th birthdays and disappear and reappear 2 years later in the middle of the night in a wood. One of them is missing an arm, and none of them can say or will say what the hell has happened to them, and one of them is missing. This is not a major spoiler. All of this is literally within the first kind of half of the first issue. 25 years later, they get back together. There's a kind of a reunion. The dice, it's all about the special dice. There was a set of special dice that were going to be a birthday present during the original game. The dice reappear. They are sucked back into this world, and it's a fantasy world. It's a fantasy. It's the fantasy RPG they were playing in. The world is called Die because it's a 20-sided world, and that's a pretty strong setup.
Yeah.
And Kieran is, I mean, if you're going to do a story like this, Kieran is absolutely a safe pair of hands for this. This is a guy who's written Thor, he's written the X-Men, he's written Darth Vader. He knows graphical storytelling, but he's also a diehard, long-time role-playing gamer and started out as a games journalist doing video game reviews. And my God, he can write, because the second issue will take you by surprise, and the third issue will hit you around the back of the head with a cricket bat. Just comes completely out of left field, and you go, you did what? I'm not going to spoil it, because you deserve, for that moment where there are 2 moments in the third issue. I will say that it's set in something that looks very much like the World War I trenches, but when you realize who's fighting, it's almost like a punch to the stomach. And then you work out, oh my God, that's what he's doing with this series. And he just builds on it, and it is magnificent. The whole thing is so strong and so good. Kieran is a friend of mine, so I am biased, but I was just, every time I'd get a new set of issues, I just go, oh my God, man, I really hope you stick the landing in it. He sticks the landing. The ending is great. They kickstarted a role-playing game. I've read drafts of the role-playing game. I haven't seen the finished thing yet, but apparently it's really, really strong. The other thing is, I don't know how much I can talk about. I know he has sold the media rights, the possibility of a TV series based on this. And I think my hope is the success of the D&D movie and the fact that it just shows that everyone understands role-playing games these days and that they're commercial. Because I would kill to see a Die TV series. I really would. I think it would translate extremely well to the TV, and I think it would just be great.
Amazing.
And that's kind of what I have to say about that. Published by Image, Kieran Gillen, and illustrated by painted by Stephanie Hans.
And I'm looking at the Kickstarter for the RPG. It's being put out by Rowan, Rook, and Descartes, which is Grant Hewitt's company, I believe. They put out Spire and Heart, the City Beneath. The Die RPG uses an original rules system written by Kieran, designed from the ground up to power emotional stories of pulp action. been play tested for 5 years, so it looks like he did find the fun. Looks like,
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. No, he takes this stuff very seriously.
yeah, I will have to keep my eye out for when the book comes out. I'm not sure if it's out yet or not. So something to look forward to investigate for future episodes. But yeah, no, that sounds really cool. I think Caleb's told me about the comic as well, and he really liked it as well. So I'll have to actually sit down and read it. My next shout out is a game, and actually a board game that I got to play recently. Now, I did get a review copy of this some months ago, and it takes a while to learn a board game like this. It is called Terracotta Army. It is published by Board and Dice, and it is a big, weighty game of worker placement, because basically, if you're not familiar with the Terracotta Army in ancient China, an emperor died, and artisans built a great army of terracotta statues of warriors to protect and guard him in the afterlife in his tomb. And so you're one of these artisans, and you're trying to build as many statues as possible of different warriors to put in the emperor's tomb. And basically, you get scored on where the number of each warrior is worth so many points. But there's also a lot of different ways to, like, there are inspectors that go along this grid, and statues that are being inspected get bonus points. And so it has a rondel for worker placement. So, like, when you place a worker on one slot on the wheel, think of like hours on a clock, then there's like 3 actions you do, but you can move 2 of those to change which actions are available on that. So, like, if oh wait, Bob took those actions, well, I can pay a coin to move so that one of those actions is available to me. It's quite interesting. A lot of complexity to it. It took us like 3 or 4 hours to get through a game with 4 players for the first time, but that was us learning the game. I definitely want to play it again. For me, it's like about as complex as a board game I want it to be, because there are some games that are so complex that I'm like, oh god, this is. I felt like there's a lot of things to do, but I didn't feel like I had to do 3 actions in a row in order to get points. I was getting points every round, and I didn't have to Heaven and Nails a game. I felt like, well, I have to do this and this and this, and then maybe I'll get some points. So this one, it's like I'm getting points. Am I just getting as much as as many points as I should be in order to win? So yeah, it's a really fun game. 2 to 4 players. Go on YouTube and watch a good tutorial of it before you play. The ending score mechanics are a little complex, but yeah, if you like big, weighty board games with really cool minis, they have like little plastic minis of all the types of terracotta soldiers that you put in the army in the tomb. Yeah, it's very fun.
It's been very well reviewed. I mean, it's not an easy game. It's quite a heavy game from reputation. I haven't played it myself. I haven't even seen it played. But yes, it's getting good notices in the press.
You had one more, I believe.
I did. Part of the joy of doing Ludonarrative Dissidents with Ross and our third hand, Greg Stolze, is that I get to read an awful lot of role-playing games that either I read in the past and have put to one side, or that I hadn't previously come across. And I thought about talking about one that we're actually about to record the podcast for in a day or two, Tales from the Loop. But I think actually I'm going to flash back to a game that I've known for about 20 years that we did in a recent episode, which is Dread, which Ross, you referred to briefly earlier on. Because Dread is a horror game that just ditches all the conventional mechanics that you would expect to find in a horror role-playing game and goes, get a copy of Jenga. And it's genius. It's just absolute genius as you would try to accomplish tasks within the narrative. Anything that there's a risk, you have to take a block out of the Jenga tower and put it on the top. So as the game goes on, the structure becomes more and more precarious, and therefore your position becomes more and more, your situation just becomes worse and worse and more likely to just collapse into chaos. And, the person who tips the tower or who knocks the tower over at the end not at the end. Their character immediately leaves the game. Not necessarily dead. They may flee. They may disappear. Whatever it is. But talking about push your luck mechanics, that's push your luck. You have to take the brick. But you're aware that every time you do, you are increasing the risk, not only for yourself, but for everyone else. Yeah. And that's basically, it's what I was saying about Baron Munchausen. It's not just, you could boil it down to a page or two of rules. They've published it as a book. But the rest of the book is essentially just brilliant advice for running horror role-playing games. Mm-hmm. Really, really smart stuff. And one of my great regrets in running Hogshead Publishing is there are two major games that I was pitched and turned down. One of which is Unknown Armies, which Greg was one of the designers on, which I stand by actually, because I think the draft I was pitched was not quite properly baked. It didn't feel finished to me, and I stand by that. But I was also pitched Dread, and for various reasons, I turned it down. And I wish I hadn't. I wish I'd published it, because it's so smart and so clever and so immediate and just great. It's such an easy concept. Everyone has access to it. If you phone around your role-playing group and say, someone bring a copy of Jenga, someone's going to have a copy of Jenga. Oh, sure. You bring it, it's not hard to get. It's a lot easier to get a copy of Jenga than it was to get a set of polyhedral dice in the 1970s, I can tell you. Yeah. And it will give you a fantastic evening of play. Dread is not a long-term, it's not a campaign-based game. It's not something you're going to pull out every single evening. But for 1 or 2 sessions, it's just a bravura piece of design. And as a text, if you're looking for a text for some, is it possible to do a role-playing game that abandons the previous idea, almost everything that role-playing games have done up to this point, and does something completely different? Yes. And it's a triumph.
Yeah. Dread is great because it captures the horror tension of we're all in this together, but boy, I hope that you're the one that gets eaten by the monster. Please fuck up. I don't want to die. And if it's killing you, it's not killing me. It's great. And it's once you understand it, yeah, you could run it anywhere. You can, you don't need, it has questionnaires and things to help flesh out the role playing aspects of it, but you don't need to. It's one of these games that every time it's oh, interesting, role playing game design. Well, have you heard of Dread? There it is. There's the good design. That's quite fun. If you haven't played it at this point, go ahead and get it. It's definitely worth it. Finally, I would like to mention Jury Duty, which is a new show on a new streaming platform called Freevee, I think, which is free like Tubi. And it's a comedy show, which is it's a fake trial, a fake civil lawsuit between two people. Everyone's an actor except one guy. One guy is told, you got to come in for jury duty. And guess what? We got to be sequestered. And he is just navigating this as all these people, and it's not about making fun of this guy. He is the straight man trying to be, and everyone else around him is just, very ridiculous. In fact, they even get the actual real actor, James Marsden, who probably you saw him as Cyclops in the X-Men movies. Who's recently the main human in the Sonic movie. So he's got some comedic chops, and he plays himself as he gets, collared in for jury duty. And it's just ridiculous, deadpan comedy as all these people are losing their minds doing this very farcical trial. But the main guy is just man, this is really weird, isn't it? I don't know how to get this. And so there's 6 episodes out. And it's only an 8 episode series. So I'm looking forward to the finale. But it's just a lot of fun.
It sounds great. It reminds me of another reality TV show that I think only aired in the States with the same premise, that the whole thing was a setup apart from one person who wasn't in on it. And it was, I can't remember what they were contesting to do. I think it was potentially a lot of money. And it really did not go the way they thought it was going to. I think they thought that they were just going to portray this guy as a schlub and kind of make fun of him. And the audience really started rooting for him, and they had to rewrite it on the fly. And I'm completely blanking on the name of it. I mean, there are documentaries about this show. It's like that. I wanted to say it's The Biggest Loser. It's not The Biggest Loser. That's one about weight loss, which, oh God. I have made the mistake of Googling American reality TV shows from the early 2000s, and there's just so many of them. As we've been talking, I've only got as far as The Seas, and I haven't found it. But yeah, so it's not an original idea, but it sounds like a really interesting twist on it.
Yeah, no, it's just fun. Like I do like shows like this, especially that sort of blur the line between reality and going back to King and Yale Carcosa, between reality and unreality. A recent one I watched was Nathan Felder's The Rehearsal, where he's like, you have this big awkward thing coming up. Well, let me help you by helping you rehearse for it. So you want to tell your friend the secret? Okay, well, you want to tell them at this bar. Okay, we'll build the bar on a set and we'll hire actors to portray everyone, and we can just rehearse it until you're comfortable doing it. And so he builds he has Hollywood level resources. So he builds a perfect replica of the bar. He hires actors that look like the regulars at the bar. That's where it starts, and it just gets weirder from there, because you're not sure how much of this is scripted, how much of this are the real people. Like, are we rehearsing? Is this happening? Like, what's going on? So, it's, I find these kind of shows very amusing, but, I think that's it for our shout outs. I want
The Joe Schmo Show.
The Joe Schmo Show. There we go.
That's what it was called. Sorry, finally got to the J's. The Joe Schmo Show. They did 2 seasons.
Okay.
Look at it. I won't bore you with it now. Look it up on Wikipedia.
Yeah. Take a look. Well, again, thank you so much for popping on the show, James. And what was the name of your...
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
The book is called Everybody Wins. It's published by Aconite. It is available in the US, and probably by the time this goes out, Australia and New Zealand as well, plus, of course, the UK. I believe there are foreign editions in the works.
Cool. It is. I've seen a PDF of the book. It is very... it is a beautiful looking book. I've read a little of it. It's quite a insightful read on the history of board game mechanics, especially because you're focusing, like, so many board game history books are just like, at the beginning there was Monopoly and the 19th century, and then there was Battleship, and now we have Clue. They're very basic level, right? Or they're like 19th century board game designs that are interesting but like have no significance now, at least in terms of what they influence. And this is actually about focusing on, like, how did we get to Catan? What happened after Catan? And like that kind of thing. Because there does seem to be that divide between, like, I played Monopoly as a kid to, like, people who are like board game fans, like, and there's this divide, like, wait, board games can be not just Clue and Monopoly, like. It's a big divide, and hopefully if you read this book you're like, oh yeah, there's all this cool stuff. But anyways, thank you again. And coming up in I don't know exactly when, Caleb and I are going to be doing a Game Designers Workshop. Caleb's going to give us some updates on his playtesting of second edition Red Markets, so we'll have that out in a couple weeks. But anyways, thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you later.